The night shift at the museum was always quiet. Too quiet. Most people hated the silence, but Arthur did not mind it. Arthur was just a simple janitor. Every night, he pushed his mop across the shiny marble floors of the Grand Hall of Ancient Weapons. The museum was famous around the world. It held swords, spears, axes, and shields from ancient civilizations. Some weapons were thousands of years old. Kings once held them. Warriors died holding them. But now they rested behind thick glass. Silent. Forgotten. Arthur hummed softly while cleaning. It was an old tune his mother used to sing. The sound echoed in the empty hall. He had worked here for almost 2 years. Nothing exciting ever happened. Just dust floors and long nights. But tonight felt different. Arthur noticed something strange as he passed the last exhibit in the hall. A small door at the back wall was slightly open. That door was never open. A small metal sign hung beside it. Authorized personnel only. Arthur stopped pushing his mop. Someone forgot to close it, he murmured. He should have called security. That was the rule. But curiosity whispered in his mind. Just a quick look. Arthur slowly pushed the door open. A dark staircase went down into the underground level of the museum. Cold air flowed up from the darkness. Arthur grabbed a flashlight from his cleaning cart. Just checking, he told himself. Step by step, he walked down the stairs. The air grew colder. The walls were made of ancient stone, not modern concrete like the rest of the museum. It looked older, far older. At the bottom of the stairs, Arthur reached another hallway. Torches hung on the walls, though they were not lit. Dust covered the floor. No way visitors come down here, Arthur whispered. At the end of the hallway stood a massive iron door. Strange symbols were carved into it. Symbols Arthur had never seen before. In the center of the door was one word written in ancient letters. Armory. Arthur felt a strange chill run down his spine. Okay, this is definitely not part of my job, he muttered. But something pulled him closer. The iron door was slightly open. Arthur pushed it. The door groaned loudly as it moved. And what Arthur saw inside made him freeze. The room was enormous. Larger than the museum hall upstairs. Weapons filled the chamber. Thousands of them. Swords from forgotten kingdoms. Spears taller than a man. Axes as wide as shields. Bows carved from black wood. They were not displayed behind glass. They stood in racks, like soldiers waiting for battle. Arthur stepped inside slowly. Whoa. His flashlight moved across the room. Each weapon looked powerful, almost alive. Some glowed faintly in the darkness. Arthur walked deeper into the armory. Then he noticed something strange at the center of the chamber. A single pedestal. And on that pedestal rested one sword. It looked simple. Too simple compared to the others. No jewels. No gold. Just a long steel blade with an old leather handle. But the pedestal had chains around it. Thick iron chains. And carved into the stone below it were the words, "Do not touch." Arthur raised an eyebrow. Well, that's dramatic, he whispered. He moved closer. The sword looked old. Very old. Yet the blade was perfectly clean. Not a single mark of rust. Arthur felt something strange in his chest. Like the sword was calling him. Okay, I'll just take a closer look, he said quietly. He reached out his hand. His fingers stopped just before touching the handle. For a moment, the entire room felt completely still. Arthur hesitated. Relax, he told himself. It's just a sword. Then he grabbed the handle. The moment his fingers touched it, the world exploded. A powerful shockwave burst through the chamber. Boom. Every weapon in the room began to shake violently. Arthur stumbled back in shock. The racks rattled. The walls trembled. Swords began sliding out of their holders by themselves. Spears lifted slightly into the air. Axes turned slowly. Arthur's heart pounded. What is happening? Then it happened. Every blade in the chamber suddenly turned in the same direction. North. Toward Arthur. Thousands of weapons pointed directly at him. And then the sound began. A terrible metallic scream. The weapons were vibrating violently. The sound echoed through the chamber like 1,000 voices shouting together. Arthur covered his ears. But he could still hear the word. Over and over again. A deep, ancient voice hidden in the metal. King. Arthur's blood turned cold. King, he whispered. The sword in his hand began glowing faintly. The chains around the pedestal snapped apart like weak threads. Clang, clang, clang. Arthur stared at the blade. What did I just do? Above him in the museum hall, security alarms suddenly began screaming. Red lights flashed. Cameras sparked and died. Deep underground, the ancient armory had awakened. And far away, in places no human had visited for centuries, other weapons began to wake. Hidden swords in forgotten tombs trembled. Spears buried in deserts shifted beneath the sand. Ancient blades sealed inside mountains began to glow. They had felt it. The touch. The return. Arthur stood frozen in the armory, while thousands of weapons pointed at him. The word echoed again. Louder this time. King. Arthur shook his head. I'm just a janitor. But the sword in his hand pulsed with power. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, something ancient had just recognized its ruler. Arthur had touched the forbidden blade. And now, the world had begun to change. Arthur's hands were shaking. The strange sword still rested in his grip, glowing faintly like a quiet heartbeat. Around him, thousands of ancient weapons pointed directly at him. Spears, swords, axes, and bows all trembled in the dim underground armory. And the sound, that terrible metal voice still echoed through the chamber. King. King. Arthur felt the vibration inside his chest. This can't be real, he whispered. He slowly stepped backward, but the weapons moved with him. Every blade turned as he moved, always pointing toward him like loyal soldiers watching their leader. Arthur looked down at the sword in his hand. It looked ordinary, but now soft blue light flowed across the blade like moving water. Strange symbols slowly appeared along the steel. Symbols Arthur had never seen before. Suddenly the ground shook again. Boom! Dust fell from the stone ceiling. Arthur grabbed a nearby pillar to keep from falling. What did I wake up? He muttered nervously. Above him, the museum alarms were still screaming. Red emergency lights flashed through the stairway. But something far bigger was happening. Far beyond the museum walls. Far beyond the city. Across the entire world, ancient weapons were waking up. Deep in the frozen mountains of northern Europe, an old sword lay buried inside a forgotten Viking tomb. It had rested there for nearly 1,000 years beside the skeleton of a warrior king. Suddenly the sword began to glow. The ancient runes carved into the blade lit up with blue fire. The skeleton beside it slowly turned to dust as the sword lifted slightly from the stone floor. The blade trembled, then slowly turned north, toward Arthur, and a whisper echoed through the frozen tomb. King. Thousands of miles away in the burning sands of Egypt, a golden spear rested inside a sealed temple chamber. The spear had belonged to a warrior guardian who protected a forgotten empire. For centuries, nothing had disturbed it. But tonight the spear suddenly vibrated violently. The stone walls cracked. Sand poured from the ceiling as the spear slowly rose into the air. Its tip turned in one direction. North. Toward Arthur. And the same ancient voice whispered again. King. And it was not just a few weapons. All over the world, ancient blades were awakening. Hidden axes buried beneath forests. Spears locked inside museums. Swords resting inside forgotten castles. Even weapons lost at the bottom of the ocean began to glow in the dark water. They all pointed in the same direction. North. Toward one man. Arthur. Back in the underground armory, Arthur could feel the sword growing warmer in his hand. Almost like it was alive. Suddenly the massive iron door behind him slammed shut. Bang! Arthur jumped in shock. What now? The torches along the walls suddenly ignited with blue flames. The chamber became brighter, revealing even more weapons than Arthur first noticed. Thousands. Maybe tens of thousands. All watching him. Then something new happened. One of the swords slowly floated out of its rack. Arthur stared at it in disbelief. No way. The sword hovered in the air, then gently lowered itself to the stone floor in front of him. It pointed its blade downward, like it was kneeling. Then another weapon did the same. And another. And another. Soon dozens of weapons floated down and rested on the ground in front of Arthur. All kneeling. Arthur swallowed nervously. This is insane. Then the sword in Arthur's hand suddenly flashed with bright light. A powerful wave of energy burst from the blade. The light rushed across the chamber walls, revealing a massive mural carved into the ancient stone. Arthur slowly turned his flashlight toward it. The mural showed a battlefield. Thousands of warriors fighting under a dark sky. But at the center of the carving stood one man. A king. He held a sword that looked exactly like the one Arthur now carried. Around him stood countless weapons floating in the air like loyal guardians. Arthur stepped closer to the mural. That sword. It was the same blade. The exact same one. The king in the mural looked powerful. Tall. Fearless. And above his head, ancient symbols formed one title. The Weapon King. Arthur stared at the carving, confused. What does this have to do with me? Suddenly the sword in his hand pulsed again. And a deep voice filled the chamber. This voice was different. Older. Stronger. It did not scream. It spoke slowly. The king has returned. Arthur's heart nearly stopped. Returned. The voice continued. After 1,000 years. The blade has chosen again. Arthur shook his head. No. No way. I'm not a king. I clean floors for a living. The weapons around him vibrated softly. Almost like they were laughing. The voice spoke again. You were hidden. Until the world needed you again. Arthur felt dizzy. What world? Needed for what? Suddenly the chamber lights flickered. The sword in Arthur's hand began glowing brighter. Then the voice spoke one final warning. The other kings have felt your awakening. Arthur's stomach dropped. Other kings. The chamber fell silent. Then somewhere far away, very far away, another weapon awakened. But this one did not whisper king. It screamed with rage. And its master had just woken up too. Arthur stood alone in the ancient armory, holding the forbidden blade. The world's weapons had recognized him. But somewhere out there, other rulers of ancient power were rising as well. And they were coming. TOB continued in Part 3, The Final King's War. The underground armory had gone completely silent. Arthur stood in the middle of the chamber, holding the glowing sword while thousands of ancient weapons rested around him like loyal soldiers waiting for orders. The blue flames from the torches flickered softly against the stone walls. Arthur's heart was still racing. Other kings, he whispered nervously. What does that even mean? For a moment, nothing happened. Then the sword in his hand pulsed again. A wave of soft light moved across the blade, and suddenly the entire chamber floor began to glow with ancient symbols. Arthur stepped back in shock. What now? The light formed a circle around him. Then the deep voice returned. The same powerful voice that had spoken before. Long ago, before the modern world, there were 5 weapon kings. Arthur listened carefully. The voice continued slowly, like it was telling a story older than history itself. They were not chosen by men. They were chosen by the weapons. Arthur looked around at the thousands of swords and spears surrounding him. So you're saying weapons choose kings? The voice answered. Only the strongest soul can command them. Arthur shook his head. I'm not strong. I'm a janitor. But the voice ignored his protest. The glowing symbols on the floor began to change. Images appeared in the light like moving shadows. Arthur saw 5 warriors standing on a battlefield long ago. Each one held a powerful weapon glowing with strange energy. One king carried a flaming spear. Another held a massive black axe. One controlled golden arrows that floated in the air around him. Another wielded chains made of pure metal light. And at the center stood the 5th king. He held a simple sword. The same sword Arthur now carried. Arthur stared at the image. That's my sword. The voice spoke again. The blade of command. The glowing image showed the 5th king raising the sword into the sky. At once, thousands of weapons lifted into the air around him like an army. Arthur watched in amazement. That king could control every weapon? Yes. Arthur felt his stomach twist. You mean like what happened here? The voice answered calmly. You are the next weapon king. Arthur nearly dropped the sword. No. No way. His voice echoed through the chamber. I clean bathrooms and mop floors. I'm not some ancient king. But the sword glowed brighter in his hand. And the weapons around him began to hum softly. The voice continued. The blade never chooses wrong. Arthur ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. This is insane. Then the glowing images changed again. This time Arthur saw the battlefield filled with fire and destruction. The 5 kings were fighting each other. Their weapons clashed like thunder. Mountains collapsed. Armies were destroyed. The sky itself looked torn apart. Arthur watched in horror. They fought each other? The voice answered. Power always attracts war. Arthur watched as one king fell. Then another. Eventually only one remained standing. The king with the sword. The weapon king. Arthur swallowed. So what happened next? The glowing image faded slowly. The voice spoke with a heavy tone. The last king sealed the armory. And disappeared. Arthur looked around the chamber again. This armory? Yes. Arthur's mind was spinning. So, you're saying the last weapon king hid all these weapons so no one could use them again? Until the world needed a king again. Arthur sighed deeply. Let me guess, that's now. Before the voice could answer, the entire chamber suddenly shook violently. Boom! Arthur grabbed the pedestal to keep from falling. What was that? The sword in his hand suddenly flashed bright red for a moment. Then the deep voice spoke again. But this time it sounded worried. The other kings are awakening. Arthur felt his heart drop. You mean the ones from before? Yes. Arthur stared toward the iron door of the armory. How is that possible? The voice answered slowly. When the weapon king returns, the others always follow. Arthur groaned softly. Great. So I accidentally started an ancient king war. The weapons around him trembled gently, almost like they were ready for battle. Arthur looked down at the glowing sword. You picked the wrong guy, he said quietly. But then something strange happened. The sword's light softened. And suddenly Arthur felt something inside his mind. A memory that wasn't his own. A battlefield. Warriors shouting. Thousands of weapons flying through the air like a storm of steel. And a king standing calmly in the middle of it all, commanding everything. Arthur gasped and stumbled backward as the vision disappeared. What was that? The voice answered. The king's memory. Arthur slowly realized something. That king, he wasn't cruel. The voice remained silent. Arthur looked around the armory again. All these weapons, they weren't made for destruction. They were made for protection. For the first time, the voice sounded almost pleased. You understand. Arthur tightened his grip on the sword. So the weapon king isn't supposed to conquer the world. He looked at the thousands of weapons surrounding him. He's supposed to protect it. The sword suddenly glowed brighter than before. The weapons around him lifted slightly into the air. The voice spoke one final time. Now you are ready. Arthur took a deep breath. Ready for what? Suddenly the iron door of the armory burst open with a loud crash. Bang! Cold wind rushed into the chamber. And far in the distance, Arthur could hear something terrifying. The sound of another ancient weapon screaming. But this scream was filled with rage. Arthur looked toward the door and sighed. Well, he lifted the glowing sword slightly. Guess the janitor just got promoted. Thousands of weapons behind him lifted into the air, like a storm waiting to be unleashed. The weapon king had returned. And the world would soon learn that the quiet janitor named Arthur was now the ruler of every blade on earth.